Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, I'd like to discuss the events that unfolded since the Ukrainian attack on Russian airfields. What's most interesting here is that we have the same number of facts and the same chain of events, but you have vastly different interpretations that are coming from various primarily Western sources and some independent ones. And most of them miss the entire picture of what is important. And this is where I come with my thesis. The most important thing is the details in the memorandum that the Russians presented in Istanbul. And the most important is what exactly Putin and Trump talked about. But let's go one step at a time and go over these truly historic events, a very dramatic unfolding of the drama that, if it is being positive, will lead to sustainable peace in Ukraine. If it goes negative, if things go out of hand and out of control, the world may actually wind down in a nuclear war. So let's go one thing at a time, and I'll start with the reactions. With the reactions to the Russian memorandum, and most importantly to the terrorist attack on Russian airfields that had unfolded on Monday and Tuesday in Western media. We start with Zelensky's reaction, which is that he rejected it out of hand and said that this is all propaganda, or that this is Putin's ultimatum. He's not interested in discussing it. And Yermak went to Washington to demand sanctions on Russia. One has an impression that they really didn't care that much what exactly was in the Russian memorandum or what exactly Russian position was. They were waiting to say what they were going to say anyway, in any case. And this was repeated over and over by all the backers of Zelensky in the European Union and in NATO. Basically, their goal was to have those negotiations ended, to blame Russia that the negotiations ended, and then to demand more sanctions and to demand more weapons and to continue the policy of Joe Biden and of neoconservatives. And the most important task was to place Trump in the position that he could not refuse to back Ukraine and Zelensky. This seems to have been the plan, but my argument is it didn't work, and I will explain later why. So the reaction of Zelensky, I just said, the reaction of his backers, and that is Secretary General of NATO is Rutte. There was a meeting in Vilnius on Monday, and among the backers of Ukraine, they all gathered there, 9 countries of NATO, and they basically have the same thing, as if nothing happened, as if things were exactly as they were a month ago, 2 months ago, a year ago, or 2 years ago. And that is Ukraine, the same mantra is repeated over and over. Ukraine has a right to defend itself. Ukraine needs the support of NATO. And then the most important thing, despite everything that was said by Trump and Witkoff and others, that there's no talk anymore, it's not on the agenda anymore to have Ukraine and NATO, Rutte says exactly the opposite. The future of Ukraine is in NATO. Now, when some correspondent asked him what he thought about the Ukrainian attack on Russian airfields, he basically dismissed that too and said Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and therefore if the Russians use airplane to attack Ukraine, then Ukraine has the right to attack Russian airplanes. Now, of course, this is against the treaty which is between Russia and the United States. This is strategic nuclear aviation, nuclear capable aviation. It has to be unprotected. It has to be seen from the skies. This is a part of the treaty. So basically, the General Secretary of NATO says that the treaty that was signed by the United States and Russia can be violated by Ukraine, or for that matter, any other terrorist group, because these airplanes could be used in something Rutte doesn't like. Anyway, this is very revealing. And then if you go over the Western media, Le Monde and Fox and CNN and all the other ones, what's so interesting in their reaction is that they completely, like 100%, did not they did not discuss, they skipped the Russian memorandum, what exactly it says and what it proposes in terms of a peace settlement or the ceasefire that they're supposedly so eager to have. Nothing of the sort. The only thing they emphasize is that this is a non-starter without actually discussing any details. This is no good. What Russians propose is a dictate without actually discussing what needs to be done. And in their coverage of the terrorist acts committed by Ukrainian special forces, all the attention is on the airplanes, how many of them were hit and repairable or not repairable. Very few of them actually mention a much more serious, from the Russian point of view, a much more serious damage, which is the bombing of the train with passengers, with civilians, and the blowing up of the bridge for that train. So now let's go to Putin's reaction. And that's also quite interesting and quite different. As I said in my previous video, Putin's reaction was slow, and it's always like that. He never responds immediately. He always takes time to develop a response. And to everybody's surprise, despite these acts, the Russian delegation went to Istanbul and the meeting took place. However, it is the next day that Putin gave a very different reaction. And this is now one of the most important things. And that is that he went on the television, broadcast his conference with various agencies and police and FSB and members of government and so on. And what he said basically is that Ukraine is a terrorist state. And there could be no negotiations, I quote, no negotiations with the terrorists. And that Zeensky is a terrorist who supervised the terrorist organization. And moreover, the implication of that reasoning is that there's not going to be any deal with that kind of a regime. That doesn't mean no negotiations, though, and we'll go over it in the memorandum, what exactly Putin proposed. And I think this is probably the most important thing. Now, before I go to the memorandum, the next thing that happened is the phone call to Putin and Trump talked on the phone. And again, Western media skipped it all completely. And the only thing that they drew out of that conversation is that Putin threatened retaliation. This is what the major media says all along. Putin threatened retaliation. Well, of course he did. What do you think? Would the United States actually not retaliate if its strategic aircraft was attacked by anyone, a terrorist group or a terrorist state? Well, the answer probably will be American airplanes would have been already in the air bombing that country. So what they took out of that, what mass media took out of that conversation is that Putin informed Trump that there would be retaliation. Now, my view, of course, my dear listeners, is this is not the most important thing. And the most important thing, which was reported in the Russian media, is that they had a good conversation and Trump confirmed in his own response publicly that it was a good conversation. And then, and that's the most important thing, Trump asked Putin to intervene and provide liaison or help in negotiations with Iran. Now, my reasoning is this. If somebody asks something for a favor, it couldn't be that they're not getting along. In other words, the implication is that Putin explained to Trump what happened and what he's going to do, and it seemed logical to suggest that Trump went along with it. And that brings me now to the memorandum. Moreover, my argument here is that the memorandum itself was really addressed to Trump, not so much to Zelensky. because the Russians knew Zelensky is going to reject it, because that's his whole behavior prior to showed that he is not interested in any settlement. Moreover, as I already mentioned, it seems like his European backers did everything, and this terrorist act was a big step towards collapsing these negotiations. They're not interested in negotiations. They want to continue the war, even though Ukraine losing it. Well, why is that? The very simple answer, because it's a separate topic. The Europeans want to weaken Russia. If Russia is losing 20,000 soldiers a year, that's what they want. Another month and another month and another month. And then before too long, 5 months of war and 100,000 Russian soldiers are killed with Ukrainians. Now, it doesn't matter that Ukrainian would lose 5 times more. They don't care about this. They actually want the war to continue, as they think it's going to weaken Russia. What they don't understand is that they're actually undermining their own security in ways that are hardly predictable. But let's go back to the memorandum, because I think that is the most important thing. The memorandum is destined to Trump to show to him that the Russian goals are, number one, limited, number two, doable, and they really can, if implemented, establish a long-lasting peace in Ukraine. And that is exactly, and free United States from this headache, from this waste of resources. So what the memorandum say? Let's go over it. Most of it is actually what had been said before, but there are some very important nuances that are new, and that is where the specifics and the new things that are most interesting to those who follow these negotiations. So, there are 3 parts to the memorandum, and some of them concern the ceasefire, and some of them concerns the final settlement. And so about the ceasefire, Putin says, yes, of course, we can have ceasefire, but nuances are like this, which again, for any non-biased observer, make perfect sense. If there is a ceasefire, no fighting, then it's logical to suggest there should be no arms shipment to Ukraine, no mobilization of Ukrainian youth, no intelligence sharing by Western powers, end to the state of emergency in Ukraine, and schedule elections within 100 days. And when elections are held, they're free for all political parties. And concerning domestic affairs of Ukraine, even though that is towards the final settlement, and that is the stop repressions against all political prisoners, release all political prisoners, and then a lifting of restrictions on the use of the Russian language, and complete freedom of religion, which I discussed in a previous video, of the church. So that seems to be normal, reasonable, and doable. That is a roadmap towards the final settlement. As far as the final settlement is concerned, he repeated, but again in a much more detailed and concrete ways, what had been said before about the status of Ukraine. It should be non-nuclear. By the way, this was in Ukrainian constitution in 1991. Non-bloc, which means no membership in any military organization, which was in Ukrainian constitution of 1991. No membership of NATO, no presence of any foreign troops on its territory, advisors or any other capacity. New element, no membership in EU. Now that is a hardening of the Russian position, because in the past they didn't mind if Ukraine was in EU, but now when EU is a champion of NATO and is hardly distinguishable of itself, and now that EU is planning to spend $150 billion in the next few years to rearm itself because they want to they're preparing themselves for a war with Russia, well, in that case, Russian demand is no membership in EU or NATO or any of those. Now, what's new and most important in terms of Ukrainian security, those that are so much worried about Ukrainian security and so-called Russian aggression in the future, there's a very, very good item on that, which is that Ukrainian security would be guaranteed by the Security Council, by the treaty, and by the international law, which means that the United States, France, and Britain have 3 seats in the Security Council, and they could always block any decision concerning Ukraine over as a matter of international law by the decision of Security Council. So this is a very again a very important provision, because it undercuts those in the West who say, oh, Ukraine is just number one, and after that they're going to go after Poland, and after that they're going to go after the Baltics. Well, Putin basically says, look, Ukraine can exist. It can exist, and it can have a government of its own, not controlled by Russia. But all of these have to be accepted. Plus, of course, the 4 provinces populated by the Russians who seceded from Ukraine in 2014 and who voted in a referendum to join Russia. So these are the conditions that were reiterated. Now look at this way. From the point of view of President Trump, Putin signals to him that this is the roadmap we want. We've spent enough effort and Russian soldiers' lives, and we will not accept anything less. But this is not all of Ukraine. This is not even including Odessa and Kharkov. This is what we offer now. That's one thing. The other option, which is offered to President Trump by Zelensky, is continue the war, more shipments of arms, drastic sanctions on Russia, drastic sanctions on India and other countries that buy Russian oil. In other words, escalation that could easily get out of hand and create a war. I mean, like a military confrontation. Now, my reasoning is that Putin thinks, I think, that Trump, as a reasonable politician who has very important aspects to take care of in his budget, in his domestic agenda, in his relations with China, in his tariffs, would back him up. And here's my difference from everybody else. I believe that they understand each other. My thesis is that they worked it out. They spoke for an hour and a half in addition to all the previous times. And it seems to me that Zelensky may celebrate his popularity with the leaders of NATO and the European Union, but I think he lost credibility with Trump and with many others who actually used to support Ukraine, but now they think this is a very dangerous regime that can launch terrorist attacks today against Russia, but tomorrow who knows what their targets would be. So I finish on this conclusion that there is a chance for peace, and we will see how these developments will continue. And I want to remind you that in my latest book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, the last chapter is about Putin rule in the last 25 years and the development of his personality and his policies. So if you're interested in contemporary issues and in Russian history, I highly recommend. It is in the description. And I will see you soon with another edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Goodbye.